Tyrion Lannister felt the chill of dawn on his skin as he leaned against the cold stone balustrade of his cramped balcony overlooking Blackwater Bay. The air smelled faintly of salt and seaweed, but King's Landing always brought with it a tang of rotting fish, sewage, and the thick stench of desperation. The city had roused early, and he watched the silhouettes of small folk toiling by candlelight, struggling to find bread or coin, huddling together to endure the fear that came with war pressing in on every side. He heard the faint tolling of distant bells, the shuffle of feet, and the occasional bark of a city watchman. All of it reminded him that, despite his official station as Hand of the King, he had never truly belonged here. The lion had prowled these corridors in a city half his size, scorned for his shape even while he held the keys to the kingdom's power. And yet, he knew that for all his talents, for all his cunning, he was forever overshadowed by the puppet king he served and the scheming family that had once tried to put him in the ground. His decision had come slowly, as most of his serious decisions did, layered in cynicism and battered with every new cruelty from Joffrey's direction. Every time the Boy King humiliated Sansa Stark in front of the court, Tyrion had felt a twinge of shame and a spark of anger. Each day, Cersei's paranoia deepened, and she clung more jealously to power, pushing him aside when he tried to guide the city through the shortages and the riots. She had threatened to kill his whore and held innocent hostages. She mocked him for caring about the small folk as if that was beneath the station of a Lannister. But Tyrion had always been cursed to feel a sense of responsibility, ironically enough. He told himself it was because chaos would lead to his own downfall, but a small piece of him also remembered Lord Tywin's calls for order, even if those calls had been accompanied by heartless cruelty. Tyrion told himself he could find a better way. But King's Landing was a sinking ship. Wildfire caches flickered in his nightmares. He had ordered them made, after all, had stoked the pyromancer's ambition. The entire city was tinder waiting for a spark, and one wrong move might light up the Seven Kingdoms capital in emerald flames. He realized, with a sardonic twist of his mouth, that burning King's Landing to the ground might serve Stannis Baratheon just as well as it would serve the Lannisters' ruin. Except Stannis did not seem the type for wanton destruction. Cold, stern, unbending, yes. Just and proud, certainly. Tyrion had listened to rumors floating in from Dragonstone and beyond. The man had a reputation for unyielding adherence to law, and that was precisely what frightened men like Peter Baelish and Varys, men who thrived in the cracks of the realm's moral architecture. Tyrion, too, had always used the gray spaces between justice and corruption to his advantage. But it was different for him. He only wanted to survive. He wanted enough gold and influence to ensure he would never be under anyone's boot again. If he could accomplish that without tormenting innocents, so much the better. At first, the idea that he might defect to Stannis Baratheon seemed absurd. Tyrion was nothing if not loyal to House Lannister, so long as House Lannister recognized any loyalty in him. But there was no love lost between him and Cersei or Joffrey. His father might appreciate Tyrion's cunning in a distant, grudging way, but Lord Tywin was forever disappointed that this twisted little dwarf was his only surviving son of any competence. Jaime was the golden knight but lacking in cunning. Tyrion was cunning but lacked the golden shine. Tyrion was left in a position where he had to question what future lay ahead if he stayed in King's Landing. Would he cling to a losing cause? Would he throw away his life for Joffrey, that wretched boy? No, he wasn't about to. He turned away from the stone balustrade, adjusted his velvet doublet, a rich crimson and gold, though it was beginning to fray at the hem, and limped back inside, bracing his weight on his shorter leg. It was a modest room for the Hand of the King, smaller than the quarters he might have demanded, but it allowed him certain freedoms of secrecy. He shut the balcony doors behind him and found Bronn seated at a small wooden table, gnawing at a hunk of salted meat while flicking a dagger between his fingers. "Your Sellsword breakfast," Tyrion said with a twist of dry humor. "Truly, I envy your refined palate." Bronn shrugged, took another bite, then swallowed. "You've something on your mind, I can see it. My guess is you're about to ask me to do something dangerous." Tyrion allowed himself a small laugh. "When is it ever not dangerous, Bronn?" The Sellsword smiled in that lazy, cat-like way he had. "You think I'd still be here if it didn't pay well?" Tyrion regarded him. For all his japes, Bronn was the one man in King's Landing who truly looked out for Tyrion's interests because Tyrion paid him to do precisely that. It was a refreshing honesty in a nest of liars and sycophants. "We stand on a precipice," Tyrion said, voice growing softer. "When Stannis comes, the city will bleed. Joffrey will want to fight. Cersei will want to cower. And I'll be left cleaning up the mess, if I'm even given that chance." Bronn leaned back, arms crossed over his chest, the dagger still in his hand. "You told me you had a plan with that wildfire nonsense." But you don't sound so confident about it now. Tyrion ran a hand over his face, feeling the coarse stubble. The best plan I can muster ensures thousands die in green flames. And in the end, I still might lose. I am tired of rummaging through the scraps of power here, Bronn. Joffrey despises me. Cersei is furious at me. The city hates my family. And my father. Well, let's just say Lord Tywin isn't exactly betting all his gold dragons on his second son. Bronn raised an eyebrow. You're thinking of running. Running would be unwise on its own, Tyrion said. Stannis is no friend of Lannister's, but he is a man of cold reason. He might just accept an offer if that offer is sweet enough. I have knowledge that could turn the tide in his favor, catapult him onto the throne without burning King's Landing to cinders. How would we get out? Bronn asked. And how would we get to him without him killing us first? Tyrion licked his lips, tasting salt there from the sea breeze. I have a few ideas. Let's say I'd like to arrange a private meeting with certain parties who might speak for Stannis. Then, if an accord can be reached, we slip out quietly. If we do this well, we might even cause the city to surrender peacefully, or, at least, with minimal bloodshed. Bronn snorted. Sounds expensive. Oh, it will be, Tyrion said, smiling. But not so expensive as your life. And if we succeed, we might live like kings. Well, I'll settle for living like a moderately wealthy lord. With a woman, or 2, or 3, and all the wine I please. Bronn was silent for a moment, weighing the risk in his mind. Tyrion watched his Sellsword's eyes flicker with calculation. Finally, Bronn said, if it's gold you're after, I'll do my part. But if things go sour with the Stannis, I'll be sure to find my way out. I wouldn't expect anything less from you, Tyrion replied. Now, let me make some arrangements. I believe a discreet conversation with Lord Varys might open a few doors. They parted ways, Bronn to gather his personal men, those Sellswords loyal to him alone, and Tyrion to locate the Master of Whisperers. And so began the final unraveling of Tyrion's tether to House Lannister. He would no longer wait to be cast aside or framed for failures not his own. Instead, he would step forward and engineer a betrayal that might just reshape the entire war. He found Varys in the gloom of an antechamber near the Red Keep's lower levels. The chamber smelled of old stone, damp with mildew. A single flickering torch cast dancing shadows on the walls, and Varys stood with his hands folded in front of him, dressed in his usual silks. Lord Tyrion, the spider purred. You've come early. I trust the day finds you unsettled. Tyrion tapped the butt of his cane lightly against the ground. Varys, I've had a most interesting chain of thoughts of late. I need to speak to you about a matter of grave importance. He paused, glancing around to ensure no hidden ears lurked. Of course, with Varys, there were always hidden ears, but Tyrion had to make the attempt. I assume I don't need to mention discretion? Varys's expression brightened as if he'd been waiting for precisely this. Discretion is the only currency worth spending in these trying times, my lord. Tyrion shifted his weight, eyeing Varys carefully. I wish to explore contact with Stannis Baratheon. The corners of Varys's mouth curled in something akin to a smile, though with him it was always ambiguous. Ah, so the rumors that our dear dwarf hand is less than pleased with young King Joffrey are not unfounded? Tyrion let out a quiet chuckle. You could say that. I want to know if you have any means of reaching out to Stannis's camp. A go-between, perhaps? Or someone on Dragonstone who might serve as a channel. Varys's fingertips drummed softly against each other. There is one individual I believe might do the trick. A smuggler-turned-knight in Stannis's circle known for his sense of practicality and loyalty. Ser Davos Seaworth. The Onion Knight, some call him. He is, by all accounts, an honest man, poorly suited to the game, you might say, yet beloved by Stannis. He might be reasoned with if the cause is just. Tyrion's eyes flickered with interest. Honesty and loyalty. Rare qualities indeed. But that might make him the perfect door through which to slip an offer. Varys gave a small nod. Reaching him will not be simple, but I believe my little birds can arrange an exchange of messages. I must warn you, Tyrion, that once you cross this line, you may not be able to step back. If your sister or your nephew catch even a whiff of betrayal, they'll mount my head on a spike, Tyrion said dryly. I'm well aware. But I see no favorable future for me here, and the city itself stands at the brink. I'd rather try to broker something with a man who might show me a measure of reason than die defending Joffrey's tantrums. Varys regarded him for a moment longer, then bowed his head slightly. As you wish, my lord hand. I will send a discreet raven with a coded message. Should we receive a response, I will let you know. In the days that followed, Tyrion moved about the Red Keep as though nothing had changed. He attended the small council meetings, what few there were, since Cersei and Joffrey often sidelined him. He pretended to review the city's defenses to finalize wildfire preparations, all while quietly alerting certain men among the city watch that a purge might be coming, that the king's justice might start executing perceived traitors if the siege drew near. He subtly ensured that some of those watchmen would look the other way when the time came, placing sacks of gold in their hands, reminding them that House Lannister was not the only paying force in the realm. He felt a constant weight in his chest, a gnawing tension that someone would discover his machinations at any moment. But he had lived with fear his entire life. It was like an old friend, that trembling churn in his belly. The trick was to let it sharpen his wits instead of paralyzing him. Then one evening, as he sat alone in his chambers with a cup of wine, Varys slipped in unannounced. The eunuch's expression was calm, yet his eyes gleamed. "We have a response, Lord Tyrion." He pulled out a small piece of parchment, sealed with a blob of wax impressed by a sigil Tyrion did not recognize. A ship, perhaps. "This is from the smuggler knight. He says that if you are sincere, you must prove it by meeting him on the small islet near Driftmark in 4 days' time. He will come with only a few men, and if you bring more than a handful, he swears he will turn and sail away." Tyrion exhaled slowly, carefully setting his wine aside. "It seems I have a meeting to attend, then." "For days, you say?" "Yes. The hour of the wolf. You'll need to leave 2 nights from now if you wish to travel covertly." Tyrion nodded. "I'll bring Bronn and perhaps 2 other men I trust. That should keep them at ease?" "And what of your sister and your nephew?" Varys asked. "They will notice your absence, if not immediately, then soon after. I'll claim I'm inspecting the defenses at Rosby or some such nonsense. It's not unheard of, especially in times of war. With so many Lannister forces about, it might not draw too much suspicion, at least for a short while." Varys's tone became soft. "I wish you luck, my lord. May the gods protect you, whichever gods you believe in these days." Tyrion offered a wry smile. "Belief is for the tall, Varys. I'm too short to see the heavens clearly. Luck will do." 2 nights later, he was on a small galley, one he had secretly procured through a half-drunk ship captain with few scruples. Bronn and 2 of his stoutest men, as well as Varys, who insisted on seeing him off, moved under cover of darkness. Tyrion had left behind a letter with instructions. If he did not return in 3 nights, Bronn's men were to gather any willing sellswords and slip out of the city. Tyrion did not want them waiting around to be captured if things went badly. The galley cut through the calm waters of Blackwater Bay, the moon a pale scythe overhead. Tyrion spent the voyage below deck, pacing in the confined space, running over every scenario in his mind. Would Davos Seaworth be open to his proposition? Even if Davos was, could he persuade Stannis to accept it? And would Stannis truly let Tyrion live once he had the knowledge he needed? The risk was high, but Tyrion had no illusions about his future in King's Landing. He was gambling for his life now. They arrived at the appointed islet near Driftmark, a jagged piece of land jutting out of the sea with only a few craggy rocks and scraggly trees. It looked like a place the gods had forgotten, a lonely spit that might serve as a pirate's hideaway. The moonlight gleamed off the water as Tyrion's galley drew close. Another, smaller craft bobbed in the shallows, and Tyrion heard faint voices. He ascended to the deck with Bronn and the other 2 men trailing behind, and then they disembarked onto the rocky shore. "Stay within shouting distance," Tyrion told the galley's captain in a quiet voice. "If I holler, or if you see a signal flare, you come for us." The captain nodded, though Tyrion did not trust him entirely. Coin was his only loyalty, and coin could change hands. Still, it was the best he had. He pressed on, limping across the stony ground until a figure emerged from behind a boulder. Lantern light spilled across them, revealing an older man with a lined face, short beard, and honest eyes. A few others stood around him, armed but not overtly hostile. "Ser Davos Seaworth?" Tyrion asked. The man bowed his head. "I that I am. And you are Tyrion Lannister. A curious thing to meet like this." "Curious indeed," Tyrion murmured, then gestured with an open hand. "I come in good faith, seeking a certain arrangement that might benefit us both." Davos studied him for a long moment. "You're a Lannister, but from what I've heard, you've a head for numbers and a heart that's softer than your father's. Tell me what you want." Tyrion glanced at Bronn, who stood a few steps behind, watchful, then returned his gaze to Davos. "I want to see King's Landing taken without it burning to the ground. I also want to ensure I'm not placed on the headsman's block once it's done. I can deliver you the city's secrets, how to circumvent certain defenses, how to turn key members of the Watch. In short, I can remove many of the obstacles that would otherwise cost Stannis dearly in blood." Davos's brow furrowed. "Stannis is the rightful king, by all the laws of gods and men. It's your family that stands in his way." Why would he trust you? Why would I trust you? Because I've no reason to die for Joffrey, Tyrion said, letting a note of bitterness enter his voice. Because I know the city intimately, and I am the only one who has prepared the defenses in any meaningful way. Once I'm gone, my sister and Joffrey will be blind to where the real threats lie. They'll lash out at shadows, while you march in with your actual force. They rely on me, Ser Davos. Without me, their children fumbling with swords. Davos scratched his beard, exchanging looks with the men flanking him. You speak truth, maybe, but how do I know this isn't a trap? Tyrion let out a mirthless laugh. You think I've nothing better to do than lure you out here for an ambush? Look around, good sir. I have 3 men to your 4. I'm hardly in a position to attempt foul play. That gave Davos pause. He looked Tyrion up and down, studying the dwarf's earnest, if sardonic, expression. If I take your words back to King Stannis, what do you expect in return? I expect safe passage for myself and my associates. I expect to remain alive once the dust settles. And I expect a place at court or some measure of land and title to sustain me. I can't go scurrying off into the countryside. My name alone makes me a target. If Stannis sits the Iron Throne, then it will be safe for me to remain in plain sight under his protection. Davos's men stirred uncomfortably at the notion of a Lannister receiving any favor, but Davos himself looked thoughtful rather than dismissive. The king is not a man to grant favor lightly, but he rewards those who further his cause. If he believed you were instrumental in his rightful coronation, he might spare you. He might even grant you a keep, but that's for him to decide. Of course, Tyrion said. I only wish to place my request before him. I'll bring it to him, Davos said. But you must understand, Lord Tyrion, that if this is a trick, you won't live long enough to regret it. Tyrion smirked. Honesty again. How refreshing. I have no illusions, Ser Davos, and no designs to cheat you or your king. I simply seek a better future than the one I have now. Davos stepped closer, lowering his voice. How do we begin? They spoke for over an hour, huddled among the rocks with the sea lapping at the shore behind them. Tyrion laid out the broad strokes, the weaknesses of the walls near the mudgate, the fact that he had been building caches of wildfire but that the key stockpile was stashed in one particular location. He explained which sections of the city watch might be turned and how best to bribe or threaten them. He spoke of the gold cloaks who had grown disillusioned with Joffrey's cruelty, men who might remember how Ned Stark was betrayed by Littlefinger's gold and how such betrayal might just as easily happen in reverse if the purse was heavy enough. Tyrion's knowledge was vast, and Davos listened intently, occasionally interrupting to clarify a detail or question the logic. The 2 men could not have been more different, one born in squalor, raised to knighthood by a harsh but just lord, the other born into the greatest wealth of the realm but scorned for his deformity, but they shared a certain pragmatism that bridged their worlds. Finally, Tyrion offered up a suggestion that both frightened and intrigued them. If Stannis wants to ensure a minimal loss of life, we need to orchestrate an internal coup in King's Landing mere hours before his approach. Panic in the city, combined with strategic sabotage, might open the gates, but I'll need assurances of his timing. We see ain't move too soon, or the Lannisters might crush any revolt, nor too late, or the city might be set aflame in the heat of the siege. Davos pursed his lips. I'll bring this plan to him. I don't know what he will decide, but I see the merits. Stannis hates unnecessary bloodshed, and you're offering him a chance to take the city more cleanly. He might still be cautious. As he should be, Tyrion agreed. I'll be waiting for word. When you have his answer, you know how to find me. They parted on uneasy but hopeful terms, neither man fully trusting the other yet both recognizing the necessity of this alliance. Tyrion and Bronn boarded their galley again, and as they left that lonely islet behind, Tyrion felt the tension in his chest twist into something sharper. Now that the dice had been thrown, all he could do was wait to see how they fell. Back in King's Landing, Tyrion returned to the usual pandemonium. Street riots had flared again. The price of bread soared as the city's stores dwindled. Refugees from the war-torn countryside crowded the gates, seeking shelter that did not exist. Joffrey, in another fit of cruelty, had ordered a group of beggars flogged for blocking the thoroughfare near the Great September. Cersei had grown increasingly anxious, snapping at Tyrion for vanishing on some fool's errand while the city needed him. Tywin was still off waging war against Robb Stark, leaving Tyrion to juggle problems with no real authority. Among the chaos, Tyrion moved quietly. He feigned greater zeal for the battle to come, claiming to ramp up wildfire production, though in reality he was stalling. He had pyromancer Haelene continue his work, yes, but Tyrion made sure the lion's share of the pots were stored in a location he could control. He visited certain gold cloaks in secret, men he had identified in earlier days for their disenchantment. He planted seeds of doubt, lacing his words with promises of reward if they put the city's greater good over the whims of the Boy King. Some responded with curiosity, others kept silent, but Tyrion was satisfied to see that few were outright loyal to Joffrey. In a city as hungry and weary as King's Landing, loyalty was cheap. Weeks passed. News arrived that Stannis was gathering strength, preparing a fleet to cross the Blackwater in force. The tension within the Red Keep mounted. Joffrey boasted of how he would ride out in person and crush the usurper's men, how he would feed Stannis' corpse to the dogs. Cersei tried to reassure the lords of King's Landing that the city would never fall. The small council scurried, discussing plans for a naval defense, for catapults, for gates and towers. All the while, Tyrion heard nothing from Davos or Stannis. He found himself pacing in the darkness of his chambers, biting his nails more often than he cared to admit, half convinced that Stannis had decided to disregard the arrangement and was planning to burn the city on his approach. But one day another small note found its way beneath his door, slipped there by an unknown hand in the night. It bore a simple message: "We come soon. Keep the gates." And below, an unfamiliar scratch that might have been a signature or a coded mark. Tyrion read it thrice, then burned it over a candle flame, the wax dripping onto the stone floor. He knew what it meant. Stannis was finally moving. He called Bronn to his chambers that morning, telling him quietly, "Alert our men. We begin within the next fortnight, I suspect. Have them spread word among the watchmen we've bribed. They are to stand down when I give the signal. If they refuse, remind them of the consequences." Bronn nodded, slipping away with unhurried ease that belied the danger they now embraced. Tyrion locked himself away to think. The final approach of Stannis' fleet would be visible from the walls, but Tyrion could not wait until the last moment. He needed to sow confusion on the inside first, guard rotations, supply lines, the city's morale. He also needed to ensure that the wildfire stockpile did not fall into Joffrey's hands. That was the biggest threat. A single spark could consume the city. Tyrion had no illusions that wildfire was anything but a last resort weapon. He vowed to keep it away from both Cersei and Joffrey at all costs. He had not anticipated how lonely it would feel orchestrating a betrayal of his own family. Yet, as he looked at the city from his balcony once again, he reminded himself that there was no love left for him here. If Cersei discovered what he planned, she would kill him in a heartbeat. Family was only family when it suited their ambitions. Tyrion felt a knot in his throat, a pang of old sadness. He swallowed it down with a mouthful of wine. The day arrived sooner than expected. Word spread through the city like wildfire itself that Stannis Baratheon's fleet had been sighted off the coast. King's Landing braced for war. Tyrion was summoned to a war council with Joffrey, Cersei, and a handful of other lords. The Boy King was in a rage, demanding to ride out and meet Stannis on the sea. Tyrion tried to advise caution, just as a matter of playing his part, but Joffrey barely listened. Meanwhile, Cersei eyed Tyrion suspiciously, as though sensing something amiss. In that meeting, Tyrion said as little as possible, letting Joffrey hurl insults at him. It wouldn't matter soon. Events were now beyond halting. Under cover of darkness, Tyrion set his plan in motion. He visited the chief pyromancer, Haelene, telling him to move the bulk of the wildfire to a new storage area near the Guildhall of the Alchemists, claiming the king wished to see it kept more secure. Haelene did not question the hand's order, but he seemed uneasy. Tyrion made sure to have a handful of trusted Cell's words oversee the transfer, ensuring no accidents took place and that the contents did not vanish. Elsewhere, gold cloaks who had been bribed or turned were given instructions, spread rumors that the king meant to seal off the city and starve out the small folk, that his archers would fire indiscriminately if a riot broke out. The seeds of panic would bloom, pushing the frightened people toward revolt at the worst possible time for Joffrey. On the second day since Stannis' fleet appeared in the distance, the tension reached a boiling point. Tyrion stood on the parapets watching the ships gather. He counted them 50, 60, maybe more. They bristled with sails and banners. Stannis' sigil of the flaming Hart and Stag fluttered in the sea breeze. Tyrion watched, heart-pounding, as the city prepared for an assault. The imp alone knew that the real assault would come from within. Night fell and the wailing of the wind carried over the battlements. Torchlight flickered everywhere in King's Landing, the city on edge, watchful for the first signs of siege. Tyrion descended from the walls, motioning for Bronn to follow, and they made their way to the Mudgate. There, a contingent of gold cloaks loyal to Joffrey stood watch, but among them were Tyrion's men. He gave a curt nod, and the watchers parted to let him pass. Within an hour, a carefully planted rumor spread through the ranks. The Hand had discovered a traitor in the city, and the king himself would come to purge them. The gold cloaks muttered to each other, uncertain and frightened, for they had no idea who the traitor might be. Some suspected it could be them. Tension mounted. That same night, Stannis' smaller landing parties began to row toward the shore. Tyrion received a hurried message from one of his watchers saying that a few of Stannis' men had been spotted on the beaches near the city's outskirts. Tyrion's heart hammered. It was happening faster than he'd expected. He had to spark the internal chaos at once. He slipped away from the gate, ignoring Joffrey's shrill commands from atop the walls. The Boy King was screaming for archers to set the sea aflame with wildfire. Tyrion had deliberately sabotaged those particular caches, ensuring there wasn't enough ready to hurl from the walls. The alchemists scurried in confusion, lacking the full stockpile that Tyrion had quietly relocated. Joffrey, enraged, flung curses at them. Meanwhile, Tyrion and Bronn moved through the streets, accompanied by a small band of loyal sellswords. They encountered pockets of frightened small folk, rumors swirling that the Red Keep would be sealed and the starving populace left outside. The mob seethed with anger, held at bay only by fear of the Watch. Tyrion gave Bronn a nod, and Bronn's men fanned out, stirring the pot just enough, whispering that Joffrey planned to execute or exile half the city. The rumors took like sparks in dry tinder. Shouts rose. People began to surge toward the Red Keep, brandishing makeshift weapons. The gold cloaks, many already uncertain, found themselves overwhelmed. Amid this growing chaos, Tyrion directed his men to the Guildhall where the wildfire had been stored. A handful of pyromancers waited there, guarding the volatile substance. Tyrion arrived, brandishing the king's seal, though the old men looked dubious. He commanded them to stay within, to not let anyone near the pots, and told them that the king would come soon with a full retinue. In truth, he meant to keep them out of the way, to keep the wildfire locked down so that it could not be used by either side to scorch the city. A distant roar echoed. Tyrion felt it in his bones. He rushed outside, the clang of steel on steel growing. Stannis' men had landed on the shore near the gate, advancing under cover of darkness, while a portion of his fleet feigned an assault on the main harbor. The city watch scrambled to hold the line, but the confusion Tyrion had sown weakened them. Many gold cloaks simply dropped their weapons or fled. Others fought half-heartedly, waiting to see if the rumored purge would take them next. Tyrion caught glimpses of the Red Keep's high walls, where torches flickered in frantic patterns. The Boy King must be shrieking in fury at the meltdown of his defenses. And so the city turned into a battlefield of confusion. Tyrion hastened through winding alleyways, mindful of Bronn at his side. They needed to ensure the Mudgate was opened from within when Stannis' main force arrived. Tyrion had arranged with certain watchmen to do precisely that. A large portion of the watch was still loyal to the crown, so a fight was inevitable. He reached a corner near the gatehouse and peered around. Sure enough, gold cloaks loyal to Joffrey were battling with a smaller group of their fellow watchmen. Men Tyrion had paid off, along with a handful of Stannis' advance raiders who had slipped through a sally port. The clang of swords and the ring of steel tore through the night. Tyrion watched, breath catching in his throat, as the loyalist watchmen tried to hold the gate's mechanism. If they managed to keep it locked, Stannis' forces outside the walls would be pinned down, forced to mount a siege in earnest. That would result in chaos, more death, and probably the widespread use of wildfire. Tyrion refused to let that happen. He turned to Bronn. "We need to tip the balance," he shouted over the clamor. "Follow me." They surged forward. Bronn and his sellswords crashed into the flank of the unsuspecting loyalists. Tyrion, short and quick, ducked beneath a swinging halberd, driving a dagger into the thigh of a watchman. He felt the man's warm blood spatter on his hand, and the watchman let out a strangled cry. Bronn sliced another across the throat, swift and brutal. The fighting was fierce but brief. The Loyalists, outnumbered and taken from behind, wavered and broke. A few flung down their weapons while others tried to flee. One of the bribed watchmen, a stout fellow with a scar across his nose, yelled to the wheel, "Raise the portcullis!" They rushed to the mechanism that controlled the thick iron gate. Ropes creaked and groaned as the wheel spun, lifting the bars that sealed the entrance to King's Landing. Tyrion looked on, chest heaving, blood splashed across his doublet as the gate rose. Beyond it, flickering torches revealed the shapes of Stannis' soldiers waiting with taut nerves. A cheer went up among them, and soon they poured through, disciplined ranks seizing the gatehouse from within. Tyrion's bribes and sabotage had done their work. Within minutes, hundreds of Stannis' men surged into the city. They formed ranks, pushing deeper toward the Red Keep. The pockets of loyal gold cloaks either surrendered or put up a desperate fight. Tyrion slipped into the shadows with Bronn, letting the conquering soldiers pass. He did not wish to be mistaken for an enemy. At one point, he nearly stumbled upon a group of watchmen who had not received the bribe, but Bronn and Tyrion ducked into a side alley before they were noticed. The city erupted into chaos, screaming, flames, the clash of arms. But Tyrion consoled himself that it was less than it might have been if wildfire had been unleashed. They were not seeing entire districts consumed by green fire, merely the savage ugliness of men at war. Eventually, Tyrion angled toward the Red Keep. He moved carefully, instructing Bronn to keep his sword sheathed unless attacked. Their objective was to connect with Stannis' leadership to ensure Tyrion's safety and the fulfillment of his bargain. He heard rumors shouted in the streets. The King's Guard was mounting a last defense around Joffrey. Cersei was barricaded in Maegor's holdfast with her ladies. Panic swirled like a storm. They reached the massive square before the Red Keep's gates. Fires burned, and the ground was strewn with rubble from a catapult shot that had landed earlier. Soldiers in Stannis' sigil were forming up, tightening their grip on the keep. Tyrion dared to approach, raising his hands to show he was unarmed, save for his small dagger sheathed at his belt. The soldiers tensed, several pointing spears at him. Bronn bristled but held his posture. "I am Tyrion Lannister," he called out. "I have terms with your king." There was confusion, some shouts. A knight in battered plate stepped forward, visor up, revealing a weathered face. "Stand where you are, imp. If you've come to surrender, we'll see if the king grants you mercy." His voice held scorn, but also the faint surprise of a man who had not expected this. Tyrion stood his ground. "I've already orchestrated half your victory," he said, voice ringing with as much authority as he could muster. "I need to speak to Ser Davos Seaworth, or to King Stannis himself. Now." They were held at spear point for some minutes until, from behind the rank of soldiers, came Ser Davos himself, wearing a boiled leather breastplate emblazoned with the flaming heart. He looked tense and grim, but relief flickered in his eyes when he saw Tyrion. "Hold, men," he said. "He's the one I told you about. The dwarf has been in secret parley with us." The soldiers, though still wary, lowered their spears. Davos gestured for Tyrion and Bronn to follow him. They skirted the edge of the square and entered the courtyard that led to the Red Keep's main doors. More of Stannis' men rushed past in formation, preparing for an assault if the keep's gates remained barred. But it seemed that as soon as the main body of attackers approached, the King's Guard had realized they stood no chance. The gates were open, or at least not fully closed, as Joffrey had apparently vacated the courtyard in a blind panic, retreating to the keep's interior. Davos led them inside, past bodies of Lannister guardsmen who had died holding the outer corridors. The air smelled of smoke and fresh blood, a metallic tang that caught in the back of the throat. Tyrion swallowed hard. He'd known war would be ugly, but seeing it firsthand in the halls he'd walked daily unsettled him. Still, he reminded himself that this was the price of bringing down the tyrant boy king and saving the city from a worse fate. They wound through corridors thick with tension until they reached a broad antechamber at the foot of the great hall. There, a knot of soldiers and knights surrounded a tall, stern man in dark armor emblazoned with the flaming heart of the Lord of Light. He wore no crown at that moment, but Tyrion recognized his face immediately, Stannis Baratheon. The man looked exactly as the rumors said, cold, harsh, his jaw clenched in perpetual dissatisfaction. His eyes flickered with a zeal that might have been anger or conviction or both. As Tyrion and Davos approached, Stannis turned his icy gaze upon them. "You vouch for this one, Onion Knight," he said, voice like iron drawn across stone. Davos bowed his head. "Aye, your grace. He helped us from within." The gate was open thanks to his planning. Stannis' expression remained guarded. He studied Tyrion as though examining a curious specimen. Tyrion, mindful of how precarious his life was at that moment, offered a small bow. "King Stannis," he said, "I am Tyrion of House Lannister, once hand of King Joffrey. I trust tonight's events prove my sincerity." Stannis gave a curt nod, though no warmth. "We shall see. You have served your own ends, dwarf. Yet you have also served mine. The city is nearly under my control. Soon I will claim the Iron Throne, as is my right. What do you seek in return?" Tyrion took a breath. This was the crux. "I seek protection, and a place, however modest, in the new order. My knowledge of the city, its finances, and the realm's politics can serve you. I only ask that I not be thrown to the headsman or left to the mercy of those who despise my name." Stannis stared at him for a long moment. Tyrion felt the man's judgment weigh on him like a physical pressure. He sensed that Stannis would rather see a Lannister's head on a spike, but practicality would stay his hand if he deemed Tyrion valuable. "You speak as one who expects no forgiveness for your family's crimes." "I cannot atone for the misdeeds of Cersei or Joffrey or even my father," Tyrion said softly. "I can only offer what I bring to the table now." Stannis glanced at Davos, who gave a small nod in confirmation. Then the would-be king turned back to Tyrion. "Very well. For now you live. If it becomes clear you've deceived us, I'll have your head. If it becomes clear you mean to serve me faithfully, you may retain some measure of station, though do not expect me to grant you castles and lands without proof of your loyalty." Tyrion let out a breath he did not realize he'd been holding. He bowed again, lower this time. "Thank you, your grace. You will have my counsel, should you desire it." At that moment, a group of knights barged into the chamber, dragging a captive between them. The captive wore regal robes, though they were torn and bloodied. A circlet of gold had toppled from his head, clanging on the floor. It was Joffrey Baratheon, face twisted in terror. Behind him, a battered Kingsguard knight limped, trying to shield the Boy King, though he was quickly disarmed by Stannis' soldiers. Joffrey's eyes, wide with outrage and panic, landed on Tyrion. He spat, You filthy little traitor. How dare you stand by while they—" A swift punch to the gut from one of Stannis' knights silenced Joffrey. The boy doubled over, coughing and retching. Stannis' lip curled slightly as though disgusted by the spectacle. He stepped forward, looming over the captured Boy King. "Joffrey Baratheon," he said, voice echoing in the chamber. "You are accused of treason, incest, and laying false claim to the Iron Throne. Do you deny these charges?" Joffrey's voice quavered. I am the rightful king." "You have no—" He was silenced again when a gauntlet fist cuffed him across the mouth. Blood spattered the floor. Tyrion felt a curious mix of pity and grim essay. This action. This was the monstrous child who had tormented Sansa, who had murdered and humiliated on a whim, who had threatened Tyrion's life more times than he could count. Now Joffrey was a whimpering heap. Tyrion forced himself to keep his face impassive. He dared not appear too gleeful. Stannis exhaled slowly, then cast Joffrey a final glance. "You are no king," he said. "Take him below. He will face justice in proper time." The knights dragged the sobbing boy away. A hush lingered in the air, broken only by the crackle of torches and the shouts of distant fighting elsewhere in the keep. In that hush, Tyrion raised his head. "What of Queen Cersei?" Stannis' jaw tightened. "She will be found. If she surrenders, she too will face judgment. If she resists, she will die." His gaze fell back on Tyrion as though daring him to protest. But Tyrion shook his head. "I won't stand in your way. I have no love for Cersei. She'd see me dead if it saved her a headache." A flicker of surprise crossed Stannis' stern features, but he only grunted. "Then we have an understanding." He turned to his knights. "Secure the Red Keep. Let no man or woman, Lannister or otherwise, leave these walls without my permission. The city must be brought to heel. My mercy extends only so far. Those who lay down their arms shall be spared, but if they resist, put them to the sword." A chorus of acknowledgments echoed, and the knights poured out to continue their sweep of the keep. Davos hesitated before departing, looking at Tyrion as though to gauge the dwarf's thoughts. Tyrion gave him a weary nod. The Onion Knight nodded back, a silent acknowledgement that each had played his part in the downfall of House Lannister's hold on King's Landing. Tyrion found himself alone with Stannis Baratheon in the antechamber, Bronn lurking at a respectful distance. The clang of steel and the cries of the dying reverberated through the corridors, but the immediate area was calm, with only a handful of the new King's guardsmen standing watch. Stannis paced for a moment. His expression was unreadable, but Tyrion suspected the man was wrestling with 100 conflicting emotions. Triumph, bitterness, the weight of having claimed a bloody victory. Finally, Stannis turned to Tyrion, voice taut. "I must see that the city is secured quickly. I will hold my first court in the throne room tomorrow at dawn. I expect you to be there, Lannister, to account for any knowledge you have that might aid my rule. Is that clear?" Tyrion inclined his head. "Yes, your grace. I will do all I can." "See that you do," Stannis replied, and with that, he left, trailing guardsmen and the swirl of new ambition. Tyrion stood among the wreckage of the Red Keep's corridor, letting out a long, shaky breath. He felt as though he'd sprinted a marathon, though in truth it was only his heart that pounded, not his legs. Bronn sidled up to him, lips curled in a faint grin. "That's that, then," the cell's word said. "We've a new king." "So it would appear," Tyrion said with wry understatement. "I suppose I should find a bedchamber that's not soaked in blood. That might be difficult tonight." Bronn shrugged. "We'll manage." He paused, then added, "You did well, Tyrion. I'm still here, so that counts for something." Tyrion barked a short laugh. "Yes, indeed it does." Deep inside, though, he felt a swirl of emotions. Relief, fear, guilt, triumph. He had sacrificed his family ties, what little remained, and he had toppled a tyrant. He had also delivered the city to the rule of a man he barely knew, a man rumored to worship a strange foreign god and to brook no disobedience. Had Tyrion just saved King's Landing, or merely traded one tyrant for another? He refused to linger on the thought that night. Surviving day by day was enough for now. He took Bronn's advice, guiding them to a quiet corner of the keep, a side tower used by lesser nobles. He found a small room that had been abandoned in the chaos. The door was locked, but Bronn forced it open. Inside, they discovered only dust and disheveled furniture. Tyrion collapsed on a rickety chair, exhaling loudly. Bronn rummaged around for candles, then lit a small stub. The weak flame cast flickering shadows. Tyrion removed his soiled doublet, wincing at the blood spatters and the tears in the fabric. He touched his face, realizing how close he had come to a soldier's blade more than once that night. He was tired, so very tired. "We have a new game to play now," he said to Bronn quietly. Bronn nodded. "Stannis isn't the easiest master, but he can't deny you did him a great service. That should buy us time." Tyrion rubbed his temples. "Yes, time. I'll need to ensure my place, prove my worth. The realm is still at war. There's Robb Stark in the north, Balon Greyjoy in the west, and who knows what other claimants might arise. Stannis will need cunning if he hopes to keep the throne. Perhaps that's my opportunity." Bronn gave a short snort. "Opportunity for gold, wine, and maybe a woman or two?" A half-smile tugged at Tyrion's lips. "More than that, I should hope. But yes, that is certainly part of it. I never claimed to be a martyr, Bronn." They shared a moment of dark humor. Then Tyrion rose to his feet, gazing out the small window slit. The night sky hung over a city that still churned with pockets of conflict. The flicker of distant torches and the glow of small fires dotted King's Landing. It had not gone up in green flames. Tyrion took a measure of solace in that. Perhaps hundreds had died, but tens of thousands still lived, spared from a greater conflagration. A small voice inside him whispered that the ends could never fully justify the means, but he told himself that this was the best outcome he could have engineered. When dawn came, the city was subdued. The Red Keep was firmly under Stannis' control, the streets patrolled by his men. Cersei was discovered in her chambers, cornered by a half-dozen Baratheon soldiers, but she refused to surrender until they threatened to burn the doors down around her. She emerged disheveled, glaring hatred at every face she saw, but there was no escape. They led her away, shrieking that Stannis would pay for his treason, that she was the Queen Regent, that she had powerful allies. No one listened. In one night, House Lannister's grip on the throne had slipped away. Tyrion bathed and dressed in fresh clothes, whatever he could scavenge from the wardrobes left behind. His reflection in the polished metal mirror looked gaunt, haunted. He summoned as much composure as he could muster and made his way to the throne room. There Stannis Baratheon sat upon the Iron Throne, looking rigid and unsmiling. The hall was filled with a mixture of Baratheon soldiers, lords from the Stormlands who had joined him, and a scattering of King's Landing's nobles who had surrendered early enough to avoid suspicion. A line of captives was displayed off to one side. Joffrey, still bruised and bloodied, Cersei, her face twisted in rage, and a handful of others who had been staunch Lannister loyalists. Tyrion approached the throne, stopping at a respectful distance. Davos stood to one side, wearing a weary, grim expression. A few other knights and courtiers ringed the dais, looking expectantly at Tyrion. They were curious, no doubt, to see how the new king would handle this dwarf traitor from the dethroned house. Stannis' voice echoed in the chamber. "Tyrion Lannister, step forward." Tyrion did so, ignoring the stares that bore into him like hot coals. He offered a small bow. "Your Grace, you have done me a service by undermining the false king's defenses," Stannis announced. "Without your efforts, we might have lost thousands more men storming these walls." "I did only what necessity required, Your Grace," Tyrion said carefully. Stannis raised his chin, eyes cold. "So you did, and now I must decide what to do with you. It would be within my right to execute every Lannister for the crimes they have committed against the realm." Tyrion could feel the hush that gripped the hall. This moment was as perilous as any. He kept his voice level. "I have no illusions about the Lannister name. I can only repeat that I acted to prevent greater bloodshed. I offer you my skills, my counsel, and my loyalty." One of the Stormland lords, a stern man with a scar across his cheek, said loudly, "A Lannister's loyalty, Your Grace? Pardon me if I doubt its worth." Murmurs rippled through the courtiers. Tyrion braced himself. Stannis let the chatter subside before saying, "I share your doubts, Lord Estermont. Yet a man's deeds speak louder than his name. Tyrion Lannister's deeds last night saved us bloodshed, and King's Landing remains largely intact." He paused, letting the crowd absorb his words. Then he spoke to Tyrion directly. "If I am to keep you by my side, it will be on my terms alone. You will serve as an advisor, no more. You will have no command of men, no authority but what I grant you in the moment. If you accept these conditions, I will spare your life and allow you a place at court. But know this, the instant I sense treachery, your life is forfeit. Is that clear?" Tyrion exhaled in silent relief, bowing low. "Perfectly clear, Your Grace. I am honored to serve." "Then let it be so," Stannis intoned. "Davos, you shall watch him. Make certain he does not stray." Davos bowed. "Yes, Your Grace." Thus it was done. The crowd whispered, and Tyrion could feel the stares of noblemen and soldiers alike. He was certain that many despised him, suspecting him to be a craven turncloak. They were not entirely wrong. But if turncloaking was what it took to survive, and to protect King's Landing from a worse fate, then so be it. Stannis shifted his attention to the captured Lannisters. "Bring forward the boy who called himself king." Joffrey was dragged up, trembling and furious. He tried to hide his fear with bluster, screaming obscenities at Stannis and at Tyrion. It did him no good. Stannis' mouth curled in distaste. "He will be confined until we can conduct a proper trial. Take him away." Joffrey was pulled off, screaming. Cersei followed, cursing Tyrion's name with every breath, her hair disheveled, eyes wild. Tyrion refused to look at her, though the echoes of her hatred cut him deep. This was the woman who had been the closest thing to family he'd had in this city. Now she was an enemy, her downfall aided by his hand. Before the session ended, Stannis declared that he would hold a coronation ceremony once the city was fully pacified. He commanded that the Gold Cloaks be disbanded, reformed under loyal men from the Stormlands, and that any pockets of resistance be rooted out. Tyrion stood quietly, watching the course of history shift around him. The Targaryen dynasty was long gone. The Baratheon line had splintered, and now Stannis, the middle brother, had seized the capital. How the lords of Westeros would respond to this remained to be seen. Would the Tyrells attempt to install another candidate? Would the North remain at war under Robb Stark? In the days that followed, Tyrion set about carving a small space for himself in this new regime. He used his knowledge of the city's finances to advise Davos on controlling the flow of gold, ensuring the new king's coffers did not run dry. He directed the disposal of the wildfire stockpiles, carefully defusing the pyromancer's zeal. If Stannis was grateful, he rarely showed it. The new king was as cold as ever, but Tyrion could see the grudging respect in the man's eyes whenever Tyrion delivered a clever solution to a pressing problem. For now, that was enough. King's Landing itself bore scars from the night of the coup, but the damage was far less than it might have been. People whispered in the alleys of a dwarf who had turned against his own kin, some calling him a vile traitor, others calling him a savior who had spared the city from a fiery doom. Tyrion found neither label sat comfortably on his shoulders. He wondered on restless nights what his father would say when he heard of this. Perhaps Tywin Lannister would vow vengeance, or perhaps he would grudgingly admire Tyrion's cunning. Tyrion doubted he would ever see that admiration openly expressed, but the thought flickered in his mind, an idle musing. He spent his nights reading over ledgers and reports in a cramped study Stannis had granted him. He rarely slept more than a few hours, haunted by the knowledge that even a minor misstep could cost him his head. Bronn stayed close, ensuring no overzealous Baratheon knight tried to run Tyrion through in some misguided attempt to rid the new court of Lannister influence. Life became a balancing act, but Tyrion was, as always, adept at walking the tightrope. One evening, Davos came to visit him. The Onion Knight slipped into the study, removing his glove to reveal the shortened ends of his fingers. He studied Tyrion for a moment, then said, "I wanted to thank you." Tyrion arched an eyebrow. "Thank me? For handing you King's Landing on a gilded plate?" Davos smiled wryly. "I'd not phrase it so. But yes, you took a big risk meeting with me. It likely saved many lives. I know the Red Woman and some of the king's advisors urged a more direct approach, a siege with fire and blood. Your plan was kinder." Tyrion shrugged. "I wouldn't call it kind. We still lost good men. Innocents died, but less than if the city had been sacked in full or if wildfire had run amok. We did what we could." Davos studied him a moment longer. "You're different than the other Lannisters I've met. If Stannis is wise, he'll keep you close. And if he isn't wise, I'll end up headless in some corner of the keep," Tyrion said dryly. "Let us hope wisdom prevails." Davos gave a solemn nod. "You're a cunning man, Tyrion, but you have some measure of conscience, it seems. That's rare here." Tyrion felt a small sting of pride at the compliment, though he masked it with a quip. "My father would be appalled to hear such an assessment." They shared a moment of silent understanding. Then Davos took his leave, heading off to attend to his duties as one of Stannis' most trusted retainers. Tyrion watched him go, reflecting that in another life they might have been friends. In this life, they were uneasy allies, bound by circumstance and the mutual goal of seeing a better city rise from the ashes. Weeks turned into months. Stannis solidified his reign over King's Landing, dispatching ravens to the great houses to demand their fealty. He sent envoys to Highgarden, hoping to court the Tyrells now that the Lannister hold was weakened. He directed skirmishes to push out the last of the Lannister loyalists in the Crownlands. Meanwhile, Tyrion remained at his side, an ever-watchful advisor who ensured the city's finances did not crumble. Some knights and lords grumbled about the presence of a Lannister in the new court, but Stannis tolerated no dissent. He valued the knowledge Tyrion brought, and he declared that a man's worth should be measured by his deeds, not his bloodline. It was an ironic stance, given Stannis' own emphasis on royal lineage, but it suited him now. Through it all, Tyrion never lost that kernel of anxiety in the pit of his stomach. He had survived one more turn of the wheel, but the Game of Thrones continued. Far to the north, winter crept closer, rumors of wildling raids abounded, and stories of walking corpses trickled down. Tyrion wondered if any of it was true. He recalled the words of Jon Snow on the wall, how the Night's Watch feared something far darker than southern politics. But that was another life, another lifetime ago. For now, King's Landing was quiet under its new master. The Red Keep bustled with unfamiliar lords, men loyal to Stannis who wore the sigil of the crowned stag in flame. The banners of House Baratheon adorned the walls, overshadowing the fading lion motifs that had once proclaimed Lannister might. Tyrion walked those corridors, half expecting to see Cersei turning a corner in her fine gowns or Joffrey lording his power over hapless courtiers. But they were gone, Cersei confined to a tower cell, awaiting trial, and Joffrey likewise imprisoned, stripped of his illusions of grandeur. One day, Tyrion ventured to the top of the Red Keep, where a parapet offered a panoramic view of the city and the bay beyond. He stood there, gazing over the rooftops and spires of King's Landing. The city looked much the same as it always had, but somehow it felt different. The old menace of Joffrey's cruelty had lifted, replaced by the austere rule of Stannis. Whether that rule would ultimately prove kinder or harsher remained to be seen. Yet Tyrion could not deny that the city's people seemed more hopeful or at least less terrified. Bronn joined him, leaning on the battlements. "You've climbed high for a man who was once so low in this place," he said. Tyrion smirked. "Yes, I suppose I have. Though high places tend to be precarious." The Sellsword shrugged. "You've always done well at keeping your balance. What now?" Tyrion turned to look at him, then back at the sea. "Now, I continue to advise the king. I keep my head attached to my shoulders. Perhaps I find a way to carve out a bit of happiness in this nest of vipers. Or perhaps I sail off one day to places unknown. But for the moment I remain." Bronn grinned. "As long as you pay me, I'll stick around. At least until some other lord offers more." Tyrion laughed softly. "I'd not have it any other way, my friend." They stood in silence for a while, letting the sea breeze wash over them, letting the weight of the past months settle. Tyrion thought of Shae, of Sansa Stark, of all the people who had been caught in the crossfire of Lannister games. In this new King's Landing, perhaps their fates might have turned out differently. He resolved to do what he could, within reason, to show mercy where it was needed. He lingered at the parapet long after Bronn left, watching the sunlight dance on the waters of Blackwater Bay. His mind wandered over the gamble he had made, the lives it had changed, and the uncertain road ahead. War was not over. Rival claimants still dotted the map. Winter still threatened. Yet Tyrion allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He had done what he believed was necessary, taken a chance with the stern, unforgiving man who now sat upon the Iron Throne. For better or worse, he had shifted the balance of power. Perhaps when history was written, they would say that Tyrion Lannister was the dwarf who saved King's Landing from its own flames. Or perhaps they would call him a traitor and a kinslayer at heart, though he had spilled little actual family blood. Either way, he would live on his own terms. He squared his shoulders, feeling a pang of tiredness in his bones, then turned to descend the stairs, to face whatever tasks awaited him under King Stannis' reign. In the corridors below, men bustled, forging a new chapter of the realm's story. Tyrion walked into their midst, chin held high. He was no man's puppet, no boy king's fool. He was Tyrion of House Lannister, the imp, the man who had defied his family and outwitted a tyrant, and lived to tell the tale. For now, that was enough. He squared his shoulders, feeling a pang of tiredness deep in his bones, then turned to descend the long stone stairs, prepared to face whatever tasks awaited him under King Stannis' new reign. Sunlight streamed through the arrow slits, illuminating drifting motes of dust, and each echoing footstep reminded Tyrion that, for all his newfound position, he still walked on uncertain ground. He had gambled with everything, his life, his family name, and the future of King's Landing, and for the moment he had Yet one victory did not guarantee survival in the shifting sands of power. He emerged into a corridor near what had once been a Lannister guard post. Now it belonged to Stannis' men, who lounged against the walls in battered surcoats bearing the crowned stag in flames. When Tyrion approached, they stiffened to attention but regarded him with faces clenched in mistrust. His presence still unsettled them. A Lannister among them, but also a key ally who had thrown open the gates. He offered them a faint smile and carried on. It was best to be cordial. He had no illusions that these men would hesitate to kill him if they believed he was a threat. Passing through the Red Keep's courtyard, Tyrion saw the churned-up mud and bloodstains left from the battle days before. Several bodies still lay covered with rough-spun blankets, awaiting identification before the city disposed of them in mass graves. War always ended in such bleak reminders, but at least King's Landing had been spared the worst of wildfire. Tyrion allowed himself a small measure of relief at that thought. Better to have a few dozen or even a few hundred dead than tens of thousands charred alive in green flame. He paused near the keep's main doors, recalling how Joffrey had once strutted there, handing out orders to terrorize the small folk. A hush of memory passed over him, replaced by the sight of Baratheon soldiers laboring to repair broken gates and toppled statuary. The grand red and gold banners once draped across the walls had been torn down, replaced by Stannis' sigils, black on red, with the fiery heart so newly adopted. Despite Stannis' victory, King's Landing was not entirely calm. Tension thrummed in the air, like a bowstring drawn too tight. He found a pair of Stormland knights near the entrance. Men introduced to him briefly as members of House Penrose. They barely acknowledged him at first, but after a moment, one recognized him. "Lord Tyrion," said the knight, voice clipped but respectful enough. "Are you seeking audience with his grace?" Tyrion nodded. "He's in the Solar, I believe?" "Yes, with the Lord Hand." At those words, Tyrion had to suppress a wry smile. The Lord Hand was no longer a Lannister but rather a Baratheon man, Ser Axel Florent, if the rumors were correct, though Stannis had yet to finalize certain titles in public. Florent was kin to Stannis' wife and had been among the first highborn in the Stormlands to bend the knee the moment King's Landing was taken. Officially, the realm had no Grand Maester or Master of Laws or Master of Coin yet. The entire small council was in flux, with men jostling for position. Davos, at least, had been named the King's Admiral, or so the word went. Tyrion advanced into the keep's interior, making his way toward the cluster of rooms that once belonged to the King's private audience chambers. Baratheon guards stationed at each corner recognized him or recognized that Davos had vouched for him and let him pass. Torches burned low, casting flickers on the walls. He arrived at a polished oak door, flanked by 2 guards. The men stiffened, exchanging glances. One frowned slightly and announced, "You'll wait here, my lord, while I see if his grace will receive you." "Of course," Tyrion said with carefully measured politeness. He was accustomed to this. Cersei had often made him wait outside closed doors. That was the life of someone not fully trusted in a seat of power, though ironically Tyrion had been the hand in Joffrey's reign. Now the positions were reversed, yet he had no illusions about the precariousness of his standing. He clasped his gloved hands before him and waited. The guard vanished inside. Tyrion could hear muffled voices, then the guard returned, holding the door open. "His grace will see you," he said. Tyrion stepped into the Solar, a spacious chamber with high windows overlooking a section of the Blackwater Rush. The morning sunlight fell across the tiled floor, and the air smelled faintly of parchment and candle wax. Seated at a heavy table was King Stannis Baratheon, posture rigid in his high-backed chair. He wore a plain leather jerkin over mail, eschewing any finery save for the golden crown that sat on the table's edge within arm's reach but not upon his head. Next to him stood a tall, lean man with coppery hair shot through with gray, Ser Axel Florent, newly favored by Stannis, though Tyrion had barely exchanged 2 words with him so far. Davos Seaworth stood slightly off to the side, arms folded across his chest, listening intently. Stannis' eyes flicked up at Tyrion. "You've come unannounced." Tyrion offered a short bow. "Forgive the intrusion, your grace. I had no desire to dally with formalities, but I thought it best to speak with you directly about urgent matters in the city." Axel Florent made a low, rumbling sound in his throat as though displeased that Tyrion presumed an urgent matter warranted the king's immediate attention. Davos, by contrast, gave Tyrion an encouraging nod. Stannis gestured for Tyrion to continue. "What is this urgent matter?" Tyrion drew a breath. "2 things, your grace. The first, I've inspected some of the leftover wildfire caches and I believe we must carefully dispose of them before an accident claims half the city. The alchemists have grown restless. They were Joffrey's creatures, after all, but they remain dangerous if left unsupervised. I suggest we move the remaining stock under heavy guard outside the city walls, perhaps to some remote farmland, and then neutralize it. A single spark in one of these hidden caches could cause a disaster." Stannis listened, fingers drumming once on the table. "The Red Woman has told me wildfire is not to be trusted. She sees it as an abomination of the old Valyrian arts." "Very well. Ser Axel, see that this is arranged. The Onion Knight can oversee it with Lord Tyrion." Ser Axel Florent's lip curled at having to share authority with Tyrion. "I will see it done, your grace. But what of the alchemists themselves?" Tyrion answered that one, glancing from Axel to Stannis. "Some of them are harmless enough, old men who cling to their craft. Others might harbor grudges or illusions of grandeur. It may be wise to confiscate their workshop. Let them brew nothing without royal permission. A strict license, if you will." Stannis nodded. "Yes, do that. The city can ill afford wanton sorcery." He eyed Tyrion again. "And the second matter?" Tyrion squared his shoulders. "It concerns the city's finances, your grace. Food stores are dangerously low and prices have soared. The small folk can hardly afford bread, let alone meat. I fear we'll have riots again unless we address the shortage. We must either requisition supplies from loyal lords in the Stormlands or find coin to purchase new shipments by sea." Otherwise, hunger will breed fury, and fury leads to revolt. Stannis' face darkened. He'd never had a knack for the subtle politics of supply and demand. We will not suffer a revolt in my city. I have lords sworn to me in the Stormlands, Tarth, Estermont, Penrose, Balling, Faring. Let them bring grain. We will punish any who hoard supplies to drive up prices. Tyrion inclined his head. They must be coerced or encouraged quickly before the city starves. It's a fragile time, Your Grace. If I may humbly suggest, we'll need a clear system of distribution and also, if possible, a lowering of tariffs at the harbor so that trading ships will be more inclined to dock. Right now, rumors linger that King's Landing is not safe. Merchants are reluctant to come, especially if they fear you'll seize their cargo. Reassurances might help. Stannis gave a curt nod. I am not fond of coddling merchants. But the city must be fed. He glanced at Axel Florent, who wore a strained expression, then at Davos. Davos, you were once a smuggler. You know the ways of trade. See to it that we strike a fair balance of taxation. I'll not have the realm exploited, but if slight concessions bring us enough food to stave off riots, so be it. Davos bowed his head. Yes, Your Grace. With that, Stannis seemed to have had enough of the discussion. He motioned with one hand as if dismissing Tyrion. But Tyrion took a small step forward, risking the king's impatience. There is one more issue, albeit not as pressing. I've heard rumors that men loyal to Lord Tywin Lannister gather near Harrenhal, preparing to retake the capital if they see a chance. My father is not a man who accepts defeat easily. Stannis' eyes glinted. I am aware of Tywin's movements. He is cornered fighting the young wolf as well as Greyjoy invaders in the west. Let him come. King's Landing is mine. The city will not fall again to a tired old lion. Tyrion said nothing more, merely bowed. Stannis had always been a proud man, sure of his rightful claim. Yet even a proud man needed caution. Tywin Lannister, for all his flaws, was a formidable commander. And if the Tyrells decided to shift loyalties once again, or if the North or the Vale intervened, the realm might erupt in fresh chaos. But Tyrion held his tongue. Stannis would not appreciate a lesson in humility from the dwarf Lannister who had only recently defected. Satisfied he'd done what he could, Tyrion took his leave. As he exited, Davos stepped out behind him, stopping Tyrion with a hand on his arm. I'll speak to the king about further supplies, he said, quiet enough that Axel Florent would not overhear. He's still adjusting to ruling a city of this size. Dragonstone was smaller, simpler. Tyrion nodded. Stannis is an apt commander, but King's Landing needs more than martial discipline. It needs a gentle hand sometimes, or at least a subtle one. Davos managed a small, tired smile. Then perhaps you and I can provide the subtlety. Together, they walked through the corridors, emerging into the keep's main yard. A line of new recruits, mostly Stormlanders, stood at attention, practicing pike drills under a gruff sergeant. Tyrion spotted Bronn at the far end of the yard, leaning against a wooden post, arms crossed. Upon seeing Tyrion, Bronn ambled over with his usual languid stride. Busy morning, Bronn observed. Looks like the new king keeps you on a short leash. And you expected otherwise? Tyrion asked with a thin smile. I'd rather a short leash than no leash at all and a headsman's block for a collar. Bronn shrugged, glancing at Davos. This one's decent enough for a night. Davos offered a neutral smile at Bronn. I've been called worse, Sel's word. So have I, Bronn replied, a hint of mischief in his eyes. Tyrion gestured between them. Good. Now that we've established you're both men of questionable reputations, perhaps you can help me see to the matter of the wildfire. Davos will gather some barrels and caravans, load the contents under armed guard, then cart them outside the city walls for disposal. Bronn, I'll need your men to keep order while we do it. One stray arrow or spark and he snapped his fingers, we'll all go up in bright green flames. Bronn's expression turned serious. I'll see to it. Let's just hope none of those pyromancers get clever ideas. They set about their tasks at once. The day wore on as Tyrion labored with Davos and a handful of troops to remove the last caches of wildfire from the guild hall of the alchemists and from various hidden cellars. The alchemists themselves fussed, claiming that the process was delicate, that only they knew how to handle the substance without risk. Tyrion, remembering how a single pot of wildfire could incinerate a man in seconds, allowed them to supervise. Even so, the tension was palpable. One slip, one accidental clash of steel, or one candle flame too close and entire buildings might vanish in a flash of green. By late afternoon, the caravans had rolled beyond the eastern gate, where a field lay barren save for scorched remnants from the war. Under the watchful eye of a cadre of archers whose quivers held no flaming arrows, Tyrion made certain the alchemists undertook a neutralization process. They combined the raw wildfire with certain powders that bubbled and frothed, rendering it inert if done correctly. Tyrion stayed well back, behind a small rise, with Bronn and Davos at his side. Eventually, wisps of pungent smoke curled upward, and the chief alchemist gave a sign that all was well. Tyrion let out a breath he felt he'd been holding all day. He turned to Davos, offering a small nod. One crisis averted. Davos shaded his eyes against the waning sun. Aye. Better this than letting the city live atop a powder cook. Bronn grunted. I'd rather face Sellswords in an alley than see what that stuff can do. We lost only a few men that night, but the next time there won't be a next time if I can help it, Tyrion said. Come on. We should be back in the keep before the city gates close. They left the field, returning through the gate with a meager escort. Evening had settled by the time they reached the Red Keep, the sky awash of purples and reds. Torches burned along the castle walls, casting dancing shadows. Tyrion parted from Davos near the armory, each exchanging a polite nod of weary camaraderie. Bronn accompanied Tyrion along a quiet pathway until they found themselves at the base of a tower that had once housed minor Lannister relatives or guests. Now it was unoccupied, mostly overlooked by the new regime. Tyrion had claimed a small suite there, modest but private enough to afford him the illusion of space. Inside, the accommodations were sparse, bare stone walls, a table and chair, a bed with a lumpy mattress. Tyrion sighed as he settled into the chair, unlacing his boots. I wonder how long this will last, he muttered. Bronn tossed a glance around the room, then folded his arms. You mean living under Stannis? That, and everything. War persists in the realm. My father's armies won't vanish. The Tyrells might yet decide they fancy the capital. And there's Robb Stark in the north, still calling himself king in the north. Stannis might have the Iron Throne, but does he truly have the Seven Kingdoms? Bronn shrugged. If war comes, we'll have a front row seat. Maybe we'll get rich off it, maybe we'll die. All the same to me, as long as the gold's good. Tyrion sipped from a wineskin he'd acquired, the liquid tasting sour but mercifully wet. Yes, well, I'd prefer we live. More gold awaits men who survive. With that, Bronn ambled off to find better entertainment. Likely a wine sink or a willing companion. Tyrion did not begrudge him. He was too tired to partake in any revelry. Instead, he sat for a while, massaging his aching leg, then lay down on the bed, letting exhaustion claim him. In his dreams, wildfire still glowed an eerie green, and the Red Keep stones melted like candle wax, dripping into a black sea. When he woke at dawn, stiff and bleary-eyed, a swirl of new challenges demanded his attention. Word spread quickly that Stannis had arrested several prominent city merchants for supposed price gouging, and the small folk were anxious about a crackdown. Tyrion understood that Stannis' notion of justice leaned harsh. In Dragonstone, the man had always commanded absolute obedience, but King's Landing was not a remote island fortress. Tyrion also caught wind of rumors that the Tyrell host might be on the move again, not toward King's Landing, but forging an alliance with the Dornish to counter House Lannister in the west. Westeros had become a mosaic of splintered alliances. House Greyjoy threatened the coasts, House Stark controlled the north, House Lannister still held the Westerlands, and now House Baratheon of Dragonstone ruled the Crownlands. If the Tyrells chose to remain independent, at least for now, the realm would remain divided. Amid all these stirrings, Tyrion resolved to keep Stannis' victory stable from within. The city had not yet erupted into a full-blown revolt, but it simmered. People were hungry, taxes too high, and the new king's men had arrived as a conquering army. Already, there were whispers of discontent among the gold cloaks who'd survived. Some missed the old bribes and the free reign they'd enjoyed under the Lannisters. Others feared Stannis' unyielding punishments for even small crimes. Tyrion had to walk a careful line, advising caution in punishing wrongdoing while ensuring the population did not descend into chaos. He found himself walking to the Maiden Vault, where the new arrivals had set up temporary offices for city administration. The building once served as living quarters for Targaryen princesses centuries ago, but it had turned into a makeshift seat of local government. Inside, scribes huddled over parchments, and lesser lords from the Stormlands argued about tariffs and guard rotations. Tyrion slipped among them, ignoring the pointed stairs, and took a seat at a long table. Moments later, Davos arrived, wearing a look of faint exasperation. "I've just come from the fish market," he said under his breath as he sat next to Tyrion. "The vendors are incensed about these new levies. They say no one will bring fresh catch if they're taxed at the gate, taxed at the stall, and taxed again for the privilege of crossing the Blackwater. They threaten to dump their fish in the harbor rather than sell at a loss." Tyrion sighed. "That'll just cause more unrest. We need to impress upon His Grace that if he squeezes them too tightly, we risk them refusing to cooperate altogether." "Stannis sees it as preventing them from cheating the crown," Davos said. "He hates the notion of men profiteering when the realm is in crisis." "Yes, well, the realm has always operated on profiteering, whether he hates it or not," Tyrion muttered. "We either adapt or face an empty city with no commerce. He might claim the throne, but the wheels of trade do not spin on royal decrees alone. They spin on coin." Davos ran a hand over his stubbled jaw. "I'll try once again to reason with him. Perhaps if we can show him that a short-term reduction in taxes will yield a more stable base of merchants, he'll relent." "I'll join you," Tyrion said. "Two voices may succeed where one might fail." They left the maiden vault, weaving through bustling corridors until they stood before a new set of guards posted near Stannis's personal study. After a short wait, they were admitted into the chamber. Stannis stood with arms crossed, listening to Ser Axel Florent detail the strategic situation around the Crownlands. Maps were pinned to a table showing key roads, castles, and farmland. Florent fell silent when he saw Tyrion and Davos enter, his hawkish eyes narrowing. Tyrion bowed politely. "Forgive the interruption, Your Grace, but something urgent has come to our attention regarding the city's markets." Stannis gave a tiny nod, granting them permission to speak. Tyrion launched into an explanation of the fish market's grievances while Davos chimed in with accounts of other merchants facing heavy tolls. Stannis' scowl deepened. "You expect me to allow them free rein to fleece the small folk with high prices?" Tyrion spread his hands. "High prices are indeed a problem, but if we tax them too stringently, they'll sell nothing at all. Right now, supply is precarious. If the merchants can't cover their costs and their risks, they'll simply avoid the city. Or worse, they'll operate illegally outside the city walls, leading to smuggling and corruption." Davos nodded in agreement. "We need a balanced approach, Your Grace. The small folk must be fed, but if the fishers and traders abandon the capital, your rule will weaken from within." Stannis set his jaw, looking unconvinced, but he glanced at Ser Axel Florent. "My Lord Hand, what say?" "Why you?" Florent's lips tightened. "I say we clamp down. An example must be made of a few unscrupulous merchants, and the rest will fall in line. King's Landing has always been a cesspool of greed. Show them a firm hand and they will obey." Tyrion felt a flash of irritation, though he kept his voice level. "A firm hand can easily become a strangling hand. Give them a reason to do business here. In time, with more ships coming in, prices may drop naturally and the city will be fed. If we chase them away with punitive measures, we'll have no supplies at all." Davos added gently, "Your Grace, I spent many years smuggling. High taxes create black markets. If we drive the trade underground, we'll only enrich criminals and lose the crown's share. Better to strike a fair deal above board." Stannis looked from one to the other, features carved in stone. The tension stretched until finally he gave a curt exhale. "Very well. Reduce the port tariffs for essential goods, grain, fish produce. Cut the taxes in half. But set a maximum selling price on these goods in the city enforced by the gold cloaks. If a merchant tries to sell above that price, he faces a fine or confiscation." Tyrion nearly let out a breath of relief. It was not a perfect solution. Price controls could lead to shortages, bribery, and more corruption, but it was a step away from total economic strangulation. "It's a start, Your Grace." Florent looked displeased but said nothing. Stannis turned back to the map, pointing at it with a blunt finger. "Now about Rosby and Stoworth. Their lords have sworn loyalty to me under threat, but I do not trust them. They yielded only after it was clear the city had fallen. I want them watched. If you have any contacts among them," Lannister. Tyrion bristled at being addressed by his surname with such sharpness, but he managed a cool reply. "I know a few retainers in those houses. They were never particularly devoted to my sister. They're opportunists. Give them a reason to stay loyal, a measure of protection or favor, and they'll remain so." Stannis' brow furrowed. "I'll not coddle them." "Not coddling, Your Grace," Tyrion said. "Merely letting them see the benefits of their allegiance." Stannis' gaze hardened further, but Davos stepped in smoothly. "We can ensure they send hostages to King's Landing, just as many lords must when forging uneasy alliances. That should keep them from conspiring too openly. Stannis grunted in acknowledgement, then returned his attention to Ser Axel, dismissing Tyrion and Davos with a wave of his hand. Tyrion bowed and withdrew, wondering at Stannis's unwavering rigidity. Could this man truly hold the throne for long, with so little inclination toward the subtlety that King's Landing required? Only time would tell. Out in the corridor, Davos gave Tyrion a small shrug of commiseration. He's trying in his way. Dragonstone was simpler, fewer people, less corruption. Here, he sees the rot and wants to hack it away in one swing of the sword. I understand, Tyrion said quietly, though I fear that, in the process, he might hack away half the city's livelihood. We'll do what we can to moderate him. They parted ways again. Tyrion wandered into the courtyard for a breath of fresh air. He spied a group of Stannis' soldiers in conversation with a cluster of Septons. It struck him that Stannis had largely embraced the Lord of Light, Lawler, under Melisandre's influence, yet the faith of the Seven still held significant sway in King's Landing. Tensions between worshippers of Lawler and the local Septons could spark riots if mismanaged. Tyrion wondered how Stannis intended to handle that delicate situation. He thought briefly of the Red Woman, Melisandre, who had accompanied Stannis to the gates but had not been seen much since the city fell. Rumors claimed she was closeted in some makeshift temple, practicing her rituals by night. Others whispered that she roamed the castle's secret passages, searching for shadows to kill the king's enemies. Tyrion had no desire to cross paths with her unprepared. The very idea of her rumored powers unsettled him more than the wildfire had. That evening, Tyrion found himself summoned to a modest supper in one of the keep's smaller halls. Stannis occasionally held such gatherings to discuss pressing issues. The table was set with simple fare, trenchers of bread, boiled vegetables, salted fish, and a single decanter of wine. Tyrion spotted Davos, Ser Axel Florent, a few other Stormlands lords, and, to his surprise, Melisandre herself, clad in her trademark red robes. She was tall, graceful, her red hair flowing like liquid fire over her shoulders. A single ruby gleamed at her throat, catching the torchlight with an otherworldly sparkle. Stannis presided over the meal, tasting little as though food was secondary to him. His stern face remained set in lines of concentration while the others ate. Tyrion took small bites, aware of the tension in the air. Melisandre scarcely touched her own meal, merely sipped from a goblet of water. Her eyes seemed to flick over Tyrion with curious intensity. Partway through the meal, she spoke, and her voice carried a soft, resonant quality that demanded attention. "The night is dark and full of terrors," she said, "and the realm stands upon the precipice of great change. We must remain ever vigilant. Shadows abound, my lord king." Stannis nodded solemnly. He glanced at Tyrion. Melisandre warns that new threats stir within the kingdom, not only in the form of Tywin Lannister or the young wolf, but beyond our understanding. She sees visions in her flames. Tyrion felt the hairs on his neck prickle. He forced a courteous smile. "We all do well to heed wise counsel, though I've never been adept at reading flames." Melisandre's scarlet gaze lingered on him, and for a moment Tyrion felt as though she looked past his flesh and bone, deep into the darkest corners of his being. "You are not without purpose here, dwarf," she said softly. "I've seen flickers of you in the fire, a small man casting a very large shadow. A man who shifts the course of the war with a single betrayal. Not all betrayals are evil if they serve the greater good, but a second betrayal, that would be unwise." The air in the hall seemed to grow heavier. Tyrion's mouth felt dry. He mustered his composure. "I have no intention of further betrayal, my lady. My cause is bound to the king's now." She studied him for a moment longer, then offered a slight inclination of her head. "So be it. I pray your words are true." Stannis' voice cut into the silence. "They will be true, or he will meet justice. We have labored enough tonight. Let us speak of the matter of this new faith in the city, Melisandre." The conversation shifted to the question of how to incorporate the Lord of Light's worship within a city long devoted to the Seven. Melisandre insisted that the faithful flock would grow in time, that Lawler's truth would shine. The Stormland lords mostly listened, uncertain. Tyrion took note of the underlying tension. Stannis might honor the Seven in public to appease the populace, but he had clearly embraced Melisandre's faith in private. If that rift widened, the city's devout masses might rebel. After the meal concluded, Tyrion made to leave, but Melisandre approached him with a quiet swish of her robes. She spoke in a voice too soft for the others to hear. "I have seen you wearing many faces in the flame, imp. Beneath your japes, there is longing for acceptance and for purpose." Tyrion looked up at her, unsettled. "I've no illusions about acceptance, my lady. Purpose, perhaps?" She gave a thin smile. "You have a role yet to play." Lawler's light does not lie. She reached out as if to touch his shoulder, but stopped just shy. Be wary of shadows, especially the ones you cast yourself. Then she turned and glided away, leaving Tyrion with an odd sense of foreboding. Bronn, who had lingered near the doorway, sidled up and chuckled low. That red which has a knack for making men uneasy. She does indeed, Tyrion murmured, feeling a chill. The days rolled onward. Tyrion, Davos, and a small circle of pragmatic courtiers did their best to govern the city. Food shipments trickled in from the Stormlands, relieving some of the immediate hunger. The Gold Cloaks were reorganized, half disbanded and replaced by fresh men from Stannis' forces. Trials began for Lannister loyalists found guilty of atrocities under Joffrey's rule. Some, like the Kingsguard knight Meryn Trant, met a swift end at the headsman's blade. Others, less egregiously culpable, were imprisoned or fined heavily. Tyrion found it grim but necessary. Every conquered city demanded its round of purges. During this time, Cersei remained confined in a tower cell. From what Tyrion gleaned, she alternated between angry outbursts and stony silences. Stannis had not decided on her ultimate fate. She was, after all, the mother of the former king, and in Stannis' eyes, she had practiced incest to produce false heirs. The faith might demand a trial, or Stannis himself might stage a more public reckoning once the rest of the realm was under control. Tyrion knew better than to request mercy for his sister. He doubted she would appreciate it, and Stannis would not grant it lightly. Joffrey, similarly, remained locked away, though Tyrion heard the boy had grown sullen and terrified. Some whispered that he wept at night, or that he had begun lashing out at his jailers. Others said Stannis considered sending him to the wall, a fate reserved for men who avoided execution by taking the black, though Joffrey was not a normal prisoner. Tyrion wondered if Joffrey would survive a single moon's turn in Castle Black. Perhaps that was the point. A few times Tyrion caught glimpses of Sansa Stark in the corridors, though she always seemed to vanish behind corners or slip into side rooms before he could speak with her. She had been betrothed to Joffrey, a hostage in the keep. Now, with Stannis in power, she remained a valuable piece, daughter to Ned Stark, sister to the king in the north. Tyrion suspected Stannis might try to use her as a bargaining chip. He felt a pang of guilt that he hadn't been able to protect her more directly, but at least Joffrey was no longer free to torment her. Perhaps, in time, Tyrion could offer some kindness to the girl, though he knew that might be viewed with suspicion from every side. One morning, while walking near the royal sept, Tyrion heard a soft voice call his name. He turned and saw Sansa standing there, hands folded, her hair brushed neatly. She looked thin, her cheeks hollow from stress, but her eyes were resolute. "My Lady Stark," Tyrion said gently, inclining his head. She approached, her expression wavering between fear and a desperate need for answers. "Lord Tyrion, everything has changed, and yet I'm still here. I don't know what's to become of me. The new king. King Stannis," she trailed off, uncertainty flitting across her face. Tyrion pursed his lips. "His grace will likely decide your fate soon. But from what I gather, you may be treated as an honored guest rather than a prisoner. He hopes to use your presence in negotiations with your brother, Robb Stark." Sansa's eyes flickered with cautious hope. "Do you believe he would allow me to go north? To be with my family? I cannot promise that. If your brother continues his claim as king in the north, Stannis may want you here as, well, a surety. But you are no longer betrothed to Joffrey, and no one here wishes you harm. That alone is progress, isn't it?" She gave a small nod, though tears glistened in her eyes. "I suppose it is better than living in constant terror. Thank you, Lord Tyrion, for anything you did to spare me from him." Tyrion felt a familiar ache. He offered a kind smile. "I did what I could. If you ever need help, some small comfort, don't hesitate to ask me." Sansa swallowed, blinking away tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Then she composed herself, smoothing her skirts. "They say winter is coming, but it seems winter has come for my family long ago." She departed quietly, leaving Tyrion with a sense of uneasy compassion. He had done Sansa no small kindness by dethroning Joffrey, but her life was still a pawn in a grand game. That weighed on him. The city had been saved from one tyranny, yet it remained entangled in the greater wars of the realm. Time pressed on, and the political situation outside King's Landing grew more complex. Ravens brought tidings of Robb Stark's continued campaigns in the Riverlands, skirmishing with Lannister forces. Balon Greyjoy harassed the western coasts, taking advantage of the chaos. Tywin Lannister holed up in Harrenhal, occasionally sallying forth. The Vale remained quiet under Lady Lisa Arryn's reclusive rule. And Dorne? Dorne watched from afar, biding its time, waiting to see which way the winds would blow. Within the city, Stannis' new rule settled into a harsh but somewhat stable pattern. Thieves were punished severely, which curbed crime for a while, though it bred resentment in the slums. The presence of Melisandre loomed. On more than one occasion, Tyrion heard rumors of nightly fires lit in the courtyard where men found guilty of certain offenses were burned as offerings to Lawler. He felt disgust coil in his belly at the notion. Public burnings would do little to endear Stannis to the masses. Some watchers claimed that Stannis himself stood and observed these rituals, face grim, while Melisandre intoned prayers in a language that sounded like molten lava. Tyrion steered clear of these ceremonies, finding them distasteful and dangerous. Even so, he could not fully ignore them. One morning, Davos confronted him, face tight with worry. "They burned 3 men last night. I can't say they were innocent. Perhaps they were rapers or murderers, but I fear this new form of execution will stoke fear, not loyalty, among the people." Tyrion pressed his lips together. "Burning men alive might provoke something worse. Perhaps we can dissuade Stannis from letting the Red Woman's brand of justice overtake the city. But he's enthralled by her counsel, and we can't deny that she's powerful in her own right." Davos nodded, his expression bleak. "I'll keep trying, but if I push too hard, he may think I doubt his chosen faith. I owe him everything. He made me a knight, gave me purpose. Yet, I cannot abide these burnings." "Nor can I," Tyrion said. "We'll have to tread carefully." As if summoned by their conversation, not a day later, Tyrion was summoned once again to Stannis' presence. He entered a smaller audience chamber with a low ceiling and found the king seated in a carved wooden chair. No throne but regal enough. Melisandre stood behind him like a tall, silent shadow, that ruby at her throat pulsing with each flicker of torchlight. Ser Axel Florent and a couple of other courtiers hovered. Stannis fixed Tyrion with a penetrating gaze. "I have need of your cunning, Lannister. News comes that my brother-in-law, the late King Renly's supporters, may be rallying in the Reach. The Tyrells were sworn to Renly at the outset of this war. Though they bent the knee to Joffrey for a time, they may see opportunity to chart a new course." Tyrion inclined his head, listening. Stannis continued, "If the Tyrells choose to join me, I will unify the South. If they side with your father, I face a war on 2 fronts. The Tyrells are wealthy, and they command a large host. I will not allow them to tip the balance against me. You know how House Tyrell thinks, perhaps more than I. Tell me how best to bring them to heel." Tyrion took a moment to gather his thoughts. The Tyrells prize ambition but also caution. They won't commit to a losing side. They chose Renly before because he offered them a marriage alliance. Margaery Tyrell would be queen. Then, when Renly died, they turned to Joffrey for a similar arrangement. Now that Joffrey has fallen, their path is uncertain. They might prefer a suitor for Margaery once again, or they might remain aloof until they see which king emerges strongest. Stannis' jaw tightened at the mention of Renly's death. Melisandre's expression did not waver. Tyrion pressed on gently. "If you wish to secure their loyalty, you need something to offer them. Titles, perhaps, or a marriage. But you're already wed, your grace. They might consider a betrothal of one of your trusted bannermen to Margaery, or forging alliances with her brothers, Loras or Garland Tyrell. Alternatively, you can promise them partial autonomy in the Reach if they bend the knee. That sort of concession might tempt them." Stannis did not look pleased, but he considered the suggestion. "Autonomy is a word that leads to fractures in the realm. My claim covers all 7 kingdoms." "It does," Tyrion agreed. "But this is the war of 5 kings, or so they say. Perhaps you can't afford to crush them all outright. If the Tyrells remain neutral, your father might scoop them up. A small compromise might avert a large war." Ser Axel Florent cleared his throat. "Your grace, the Tyrells are my cousins. They spat upon my house when they ignored my pleas to remain loyal to Stannis in the early days. Now they might come groveling, or they might slink away to the Lannisters. I say we treat with them only from a position of strength." Demand unconditional submission. Tyrion glanced at the man, recalling that House Florent considered itself the elder line, overshadowed by the Tyrells' rise to High Garden. Clearly, old resentments burned. Tyrion said, "That approach may push them into Lannister arms." Stannis stared at the map splayed on a table. A drawn lion crest represented Tywin's forces near Harrenhal, while a rose symbol for House Tyrell hovered uncertainly in the reach. "I cannot fight them both at once," he conceded stiffly. "Melisandre says the flames reveal victory if I hold firm, but victory can take many shapes." Melisandre nodded, her voice soft yet carrying. "Victory is assured for the Lord's chosen, but the path to it may be winding. The Tyrells must bend willingly or face the fires of R'hllor." Tyrion suppressed a shiver. "In the meantime, we might send an envoy, someone the Tyrells respect. Show them that alliance is possible with favorable terms." Stannis tapped a gauntlet finger against the table. "I will consider it, but you, Lannister, will help draft these terms. Your father is feared, but not beloved. The Tyrells understand that. They might prefer me if we offer them a seat near power. Margaery Tyrell was once nearly a queen. She may still hunger for that status, but I cannot wed her myself." Melisandre's ruby glowed faintly. "The king's marriage is sacred. Another union would defile the light." Stannis dismissed them with a curt flick of his wrist. Tyrion left the chamber, mind abuzz with strategies to coax the Tyrells away from Tywin. Perhaps a betrothal to Stannis's daughter, Shireen. But Shireen was a child and afflicted with grayscale scars on her face. The Tyrells might find that unappealing as a direct path to the throne. Another angle might be to promise Margaery a match with, who? Edric Storm, Stannis's acknowledged nephew? Or to carve out new titles and incomes for House Tyrell if they joined. In the days that followed, Tyrion worked tirelessly on proposals, meeting with Davos and a few others who had business sense. A letter was drafted, offering partial autonomy in the Reach, lowered tariffs on their bountiful harvests, and a seat on Stannis' small council for a high-ranking Tyrell, possibly Mace Tyrell himself. Margaery's name was conspicuously absent from any marital arrangement. Tyri. Unsuspected that might blunt the Tyrells' enthusiasm. But it was the best compromise Stannis would allow for now. The Raven flew south. Weeks passed with no response. Tyrion busied himself placating the city's merchants, ensuring the gold cloaks remained loyal, and trying to quell rumors that Stannis meant to force the worship of R'hllor upon the populace. Tensions rose further when a sept in Flea Bottom mysteriously caught fire one night. Some whispered it was Melisandre's doing, that she was purging idols to the Seven. Others claimed it was an accident, a drunken septon tipping over a brazier. Either way, the faithful howled in protest. As the city smoldered with potential unrest, Tyrion did his best to keep the pot from boiling over. He had Bronn and the Gold Cloaks quell a few minor riots near Cobbler's Square, using minimal force, just enough to scatter the ringleaders, but not so much as to spark all-out rebellion. Yet every day, the tension pressed a little harder, a coil tightening around King's Landing. Then, one crisp morning, ravens arrived bearing tidings that changed the shape of the war again. The Tyrells had marched north, straight into an alliance with House Lannister. Tywin had left Harrenhal to unite with Mace Tyrell's forces in the Riverlands, presumably to encircle Riverrun and corner Robb Stark. A second letter indicated that the Tyrells had recognized King Joffrey's dethronement but refused to acknowledge Stannis' claim. They cited old slights from the Siege of Storm's End during Robert's rebellion, and Stannis' refusal to offer the marriage alliance they desired. It seemed that, with no path to the throne for Margaery, the Tyrells felt better served by joining Tywin in subduing the North. If they defeated Robb Stark and the Lannister forces remained strong, they might eventually turn their gaze upon Stannis. Or so the logic went. When the news broke, King Stannis erupted in fury. Tyrion heard him raging in the Great Hall, cursing the Tyrells as turncloaks, cursing Tywin as a fiend. He demanded to know how the Tyrells could spurn him even after he spared King's Landing from devastation. Men cowered before his anger. Melisandre spoke of the fires revealing a great battle to come. Ser Axel Florent demanded immediate war, urging Stannis to march the Crownland's army south to punish the Tyrell betrayal. Tyrion watched from a distance, face set in grim resignation. So the lines were drawn more clearly. The Tyrells had thrown their weight behind House Lannister, ironically in the name of crushing House Stark. No matter that Joffrey was dethroned, Tywin had simply pivoted. The Lannisters still had a boy in captivity. Tommen, perhaps, or Myrcella in Dorne, though Myrcella was betrothed to Trystane Martell. Tyrion realized that so long as Tywin drew breath, House Lannister would remain a formidable force. Stannis, mindful that his capital was still vulnerable, did not march immediately. He ordered fortifications along the Rosby and Duskendale roads, preparing for a potential assault. The ships in Blackwater Bay patrolled the coast, wary of any landing parties. The city braced for the possibility of siege, ironically reversing the roles from the days of Joffrey's rule. Tyrion found a certain dark humor in the cyclical nature of power struggles. As the tension escalated, Melisandre's nightly fires grew more frequent, and talk circulated that Stannis might attempt some bold new magical gambit to strike at Tywin or the Tyrells from afar. Tyrion shuddered at the notion. He had not forgotten the stories of Renly's death, rumored to be caused by a shadow with Stannis's face. If that tale was true, and if the Red Woman could conjure such horrors again, the war might take an even darker turn. One evening, Tyrion was summoned quietly, not to Stannis's presence but to Davos's quarters. The Onion Knight occupied a modest suite near the kitchens, a space that smelled faintly of salt and fish. Tyrion entered to find Davos pacing, brow furrowed. "Forgive the secrecy," Davos said, gesturing for Tyrion to sit at a small table. "I had to speak to you without the usual watchers." Tyrion took the offered seat, folding his hands. "What's amiss?" Davos sighed. "The king. He grows more dependent on Melisandre's counsel. She claims to have seen visions of a great darkness devouring the land, and that only the Lightbringer, Stannis, can save us. If he must sacrifice a few unbelievers to Lawler along the way, so be it. I fear what that means for the city. We cannot hold King's Landing by terror and fire alone." Tyrion rubbed his temples. "Stannis is a proud man. Melisandre's presence feeds that pride, cloaking it in prophecy. What would you have me do? If I speak against her, I risk her ire and his." "I know," Davos murmured, "but the city is on edge. The faith is outraged by these burnings. If Stannis continues down this path, the Septons will stir the small folk against him. Or Tywin will exploit the unrest, sending agents to foment rebellion." Tyrion studied Davos carefully. "You're proposing we somehow moderate the king's zeal behind the scenes?" Davos's voice dropped to a hush. "Yes, or dissuade him from letting Melisandre push for more burnings of so-called heretics. The Lord of Light teaches many things, but these public executions, it's not how I imagined we would rule." Tyrion nodded slowly. "I'll do what I can, though I doubt my words alone carry much weight with Stannis when they conflict with Melisandre's. You, on the other hand, have his ear as a loyal vassal. He respects you, Davos. Perhaps you can remind him of his own moral code. He has always prided himself on justice, not cruelty." Davos gave a faint smile. "I will try, but I needed your counsel. You've lived in this city. You understand how easily it can turn savage if provoked." Tyrion let out a soft, humorless chuckle. "Yes, I do. Let's hope we're not present for another riot in the streets." They parted, and Tyrion returned to his tower room, mind whirling. Perhaps if Stannis could be convinced that these burnings risked the city's loyalty, he might relent. But that was a gamble. Melisandre's hold seemed strong. Tyrion could almost see the shape of the final confrontation forming. A devout king, guided by a red sorceress, locked in a war on multiple fronts: political, religious, and military. In another life, Tyrion might have fled across the narrow sea by now. But here he was, bound by a bargain that had saved his life and the city from one tyrant, only to place them beneath a new threat of fanaticism. Summer waned and the days grew shorter. The realm braced for a winter that the Starks claimed would be long and bitter. With the Tyrells and Lannisters uniting in the west and the north waging its own separate war, King's Landing existed in a precarious bubble. Tyrion dedicated himself to governance, to the unglamorous tasks of ensuring grain shipments and controlling inflation. At times, he heard men speak of him with grudging respect. "The dwarf who keeps the city fed," they said. At other times, they spat upon his name, calling him a traitor or a demon who had only replaced one tyrant with another. Tyrion tolerated it all. A living dwarf was preferable to a dead paragon. Small cracks in the new regime started to form. A group of Septons openly denounced the burnings, calling them abominations and a crime against the Seven. They stood on the steps of the Great September of Baelor, leading small folk in prayer. Melisandre's red-robed acolytes responded by chanting for the Lord of Light. Tensions sparked. A scuffle broke out, leaving a Septon badly beaten. Stannis demanded justice, but ironically, both sides claimed the other instigated violence. Tyrion, wishing to avoid further unrest, managed to broker a tenuous truce. The Septons would keep their preaching confined to Baelor steps, and the Red Priests would not congregate in the same place. For now, a fragile peace. In the midst of this delicate balancing act, Stannis decided to bring Cersei and Joffrey to trial. Word was sent out to the city that a public hearing would occur in the Great Hall, with charges read and evidence presented. Tyrion anticipated more of a show trial than a fair proceeding. Stannis would want to demonstrate his justice, while ensuring a verdict that affirmed his reign. Yet the outcome would profoundly shape the city's mood. If Joffrey were executed, many might cheer, but some might see it as a continuation of cruelty. If he were spared, Stannis would appear weak. Either way, the city would watch closely. On the day of the trial, the Great Hall filled with courtiers, soldiers, and gawking onlookers. The Iron Throne stood at the far end, with Stannis seated upon it in dark plate, his face carved from stone. Melisandre stood near him, eyes half-lidded as though in private prayer. Davos was there too, frowning. Tyrion arrived with Bronn at his side, finding a spot near the front. He saw Cersei brought in by guards, wrists bound, but head held high, her golden hair in disarray. Joffrey followed, chains clinking. The boy looked pale and frightened, far removed from the swaggering tyrant who once tormented Sansa and commanded men twice his age. The charges were read: incest, treason, the murder of King Robert, the false claim to the throne. Witnesses were called. Maesters, some courtiers who testified to the parentage rumors, even a few gold cloaks who admitted Joffrey had commanded them to commit atrocities. Through it all, Cersei glowered defiantly, while Joffrey snapped and snarled at the guards, insisting he was the rightful king. Tyrion watched with a numb sense of detachment. He had once tried to curb Joffrey's excesses. Now Joffrey reaped the harvest of his own cruelty. Finally, Stannis spoke from the throne, his voice echoing. "You, Joffrey Baratheon, born of incest, stand guilty of treason and false kingship. Do you have any last defense?" Joffrey spat on the floor. "I am the king. You can't." Stannis cut him off. "You are no king. Guards, remove the prisoner." Joffrey was hauled away, screaming curses. The hall thrummed with tension. Then Stannis turned his gaze upon Cersei. "You, Cersei Lannister, known consort to your brother, stand accused of adultery, incest, and treason against the realm. Your guilt is manifest. The punishment," Cersei's voice sliced through the hall, "you will regret this, Stannis Baratheon." "My father will." Stannis slammed his gauntlet fist on the throne's arm, metal ringing on metal. "Silence, woman. The realm has no place for those who defile the line of kings and conspire to murder Robert Baratheon, who was my own blood. The sentence is death." A murmur spread among the crowd. Tyrion felt his breath catch. He searched for any hint of hesitation in Stannis' face, but found none. The king's features were as immovable as the Iron Throne's blades. Cersei's face contorted with rage and disbelief. She locked eyes with Tyrion for a heartbeat, and in them, he saw a maelstrom of hatred and fear. Then she was dragged away. The hall erupted in a mix of cheers and uneasy murmurs. Even the highborn onlookers, some of whom had once curried favor with Cersei, made no move to defend her. The Lannisters in the city had been scattered or subdued. No one dared risk Stannis' wrath. Tyrion stood there, heart pounding, feeling the finality of it. His sister, whatever they had been to each other, however twisted their relationship, was doomed, executed by a new king on the throne that she had so viciously tried to hold. Tyrion felt little joy. There was only a cold, hollow sensation in his chest. Once he had yearned for some measure of vengeance against her cruelty toward him, but seeing it culminate like this gave him no satisfaction. He slipped away from the hall before the final formalities concluded. Bronn trailed after him, posture tense. "Well, the Sellsword muttered, that's that. Guess your sister's done for." "Yes," Tyrion said quietly. "She is." They walked in silence through the echoing corridors, heading away from the commotion. Tyrion felt a profound weariness settling over him, a sense that the city had devoured another piece of his soul. He told himself that Cersei had earned her fate 10 times over, but it did not wholly soothe him. She was still his blood, and for all their hatred, there had been fleeting moments in childhood when they were just children, oblivious to the future's cruelties. Those memories clung to him now like ghosts in the gloom. Days later, Joffrey was likewise sentenced to death, though some clamored for him to be sent to the wall. Ultimately, Stannis refused, declaring that the boy's crimes warranted no mercy. Tyrion did not attend the execution. He heard from whispered rumor that Joffrey died cursing, his shrill screams echoing in the yard. Whether the small folk cheered, he did not ask. The tyranny of House Lannister in King's Landing was over, and Stannis had taken his pound of flesh. In the wake of these grim events, Tyrion continued to serve, though a heaviness settled upon him. The city's needs remained dire. Winter loomed. The Tyrell Lannister pact in the west stood menacing, and no ravens brought encouraging tidings. Stannis, for all his might, was outnumbered if Tywin turned his full attention on King's Landing. Yet Tywin remained engaged with Robb Stark, at least for the time being, giving Stannis some respite. The uneasy stalemate meant that the capital could rebuild, albeit slowly. The small folk, relieved at the deaths of their hated oppressors, began to accept Stannis' rule, though they still feared the Red Woman's influence. Tyrion tried, as best he could, to find small pockets of personal contentment in this new world. He visited a few wine sinks discreetly, sampling Arbor Reds smuggled into the city. He occasionally sought female company where he could, though it never banished the lingering hollowness. Bronn remained close by, his Sellsword loyalty still intact so long as Tyrion's purse held coin. Through their banter, Tyrion found a semblance of friendship. Yet the future felt as tenuous as ever. Each dawn, Tyrion half expected to wake to news that Tywin's armies were marching on the city, or that the Faith Militant had risen up against Stannis' Red worship, or that Melisandre had demanded fresh sacrifices. The swirl of threats was endless. One evening, Tyrion stood on the balcony of his modest tower room, looking out over the sprawl of King's Landing. Fires glimmered in the darkness below, the last vestiges of a city that never truly slept. He reflected on the path that had led him here, the day he first contemplated defection, his secret meeting with Davos on that lonely islet, the betrayal that toppled Joffrey's reign, the fleeting triumph of a city spared wildfire. And now, the city under a grim new king who might yet prove no kinder than the last. He lifted a cup of wine to his lips. The wind off the Blackwater Bay ruffled his hair. In some corner of his mind, he remembered the satisfaction he had once felt proving his own worth, that a dwarf could shape the fate of kingdoms. Yet that satisfaction was dampened by the realization that the Game of Thrones never truly ended. One victory led to the next battle. One tyrant replaced another. The wheel kept turning, and Tyrion Lannister, for all his cunning, was but a single spoke on that wheel. He traced the rim of the cup with his thumb, a wry half-smile crossing his face. A year ago, he never would have imagined standing in King's Landing with Stannis Baratheon enthroned, Joffrey and Cersei executed for their crimes. He had played his part, changed the shape of the war, and in doing so, saved tens of thousands of innocent lives from wildfire. That alone was worth something. Even if his father cursed his name from afar, even if the realm saw him as a traitor or a turncloak, Tyrion could look out over these rooftops and know that fewer were burned than might have been. A faint cough alerted him that someone approached. He turned to see Bronn leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Enjoying the view?" the Sellsword drawled. Tyrion lifted his cup in a silent toast to the city. Trying to, yes. Bronn stepped forward, eyes flicking over the sprawling vista. Never seen a city changed hands so quickly, then try to forget it ever happened. People move on fast, if it keeps them alive. They do, Tyrion agreed. He sipped his wine, then offered the cup to Bronn, who took a swig. So what's next for the dwarf who saved King's Landing? Bronn asked, wiping his mouth. Tyrion let out a soft laugh. Saved, or doomed it in a subtler way. I can't say. Perhaps I keep trying to manage the unmanageable. If the realm plunges back into war, I'll do what I must to avoid going up in flames with the rest. Bronn nodded. War's good for coin, but not so good for living long. Maybe you'll talk the king into peace. Tyrion looked down at the faint glow of torches near the waterfront. Peace. The word felt foreign on his tongue. It might take a miracle, or perhaps a shadow with a sword. They stood in silence for a time, the cold wind teasing at their clothes. Tyrion felt the weight of responsibility and uncertainty pressing upon him once more, like an ancient stone mantle. Yet within that weight, there was a spark of defiance. He had survived, and he would continue to survive. He had found a path where none seemed possible. If the Game of Thrones demanded another roll of the dice, Tyrion Lannister would roll them with his usual cunning. And if the new king's rule became too harsh, well, Tyrion was nothing if not resourceful. He had courted the anger of his family and lived. Perhaps he could find ways to soften or circumvent Stannis' harsher edicts. For now, the city remained afloat. Fewer beggars starved in the streets. The threat of savage cruelty from the throne had abated somewhat. Fear was present, yes, but not the wanton brutality of Joffrey. The Faith, though wary, had not openly rebelled. Summer nights grew shorter, autumn creeping in. The realm's wars continued beyond the horizon, each with its own intricacies. Tyrion drained the last of the wine from the cup and set it on the balustrade. A new day tomorrow, Bronn. Best get some rest. Rest? Bronn echoed. Might find a bed warmer first. Tyrion smirked. That's one way to keep warm. Carry on, then. Bronn strode off, leaving Tyrion alone on the balcony once more. The dwarf watched the city lights, recalling the swirl of events that had led him here, remembering the moment he decided to betray his own blood. In the quiet spaces of his mind, he wondered if somewhere, in some other corner of Westeros, his father received news of Joffrey and Cersei's executions, cursing Tyrion's name. Perhaps Tywin was already planning some dark vengeance. But for the moment, Tywin had his hands full with the Tyrells and the Starks, and that gave Tyrion a precarious reprieve. He closed his eyes and listened to the faint roar of the distant waves, the heartbeat of a city that had barely escaped annihilation. He took a final breath of the salt-tinged air and returned inside. Tomorrow, he would once again don the mask of the king's advisor, guiding Stannis toward pragmatic rule. Tomorrow, he would keep King's Landing from descending into chaos. Tomorrow, he would outwit whatever the day brought. Because that was who Tyrion Lannister was, and always had been. A survivor, a cunning mind in a half-sized body, shaping destinies larger than himself. If there was a lesson in his entire journey, from the moment he first felt that gnawing doubt about Joffrey's reign to the instant he opened the gates to Stannis' men, it was that the Game of Thrones cared nothing for honor or sentiment on. LY for results. Tyrion's betrayal had wrought a new order, and though this new order was far from perfect, it had spared the city from wildfire's cruel consumption. That alone, he thought, might be worth 100 regrets. He crossed the dim-lit room, easing onto the bed with a weary groan, his bad leg throbbing. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Tyrion closed his eyes, letting the day's events swirl into the haze of approaching sleep. Change had come to King's Landing, change he had orchestrated. For better or worse, Stannis Baratheon held the Iron Throne, and Tyrion Lannister now stood at his side, the whisper in the king's ear. Only time would reveal if that whisper could turn a rigid, zealous lord into a just ruler. For tonight, at least, Tyrion would rest, satisfied that he had survived another day in a city built on shifting sands. Tomorrow, the struggle would begin anew.